Rudy. So morning to everyone. Okay, morning because I just started to prepare this morning. Okay, the idea about preparing this is to cover the topic of process costing. Okay, this topic is quite wide. So my objective here is that I'm not going to go through all of it in one video. So I'm going to have a part 1. Basically in this part 1, I'm going to talk about the background about process costing and why is it relevant to businesses. Okay, I'm going to explain that, so at least that builds up the background about why you need to know this topic. And then following that, very important is the concept of equivalent unit. Okay, this thing forms the foundation of process costing, and for that matter the foundation of process costing questions. So I'm going to go through this example, a few examples of this, and they are very simplified ones. Hopefully you understand them better. Then finally we'll talk about part 2, which will be in another video. Okay, so moving on towards the end of the video, I'm going to cover 2 examples. An example 1, the example 1 comes without opening, and there is also no closing stocks. Okay, that should give you a very clear idea about what happens if there is no work in progress. How will that affect your workings? Okay, I'm referring to what happens if there is no opening and closing stocks. How would that appear like in a question? Of course, subsequently the last thing that we'll do is an example 2. Example 2 will come with opening and closing stocks. Now this stock I'm talking about is work in progress. Now how would that affect process costing? Okay, so this would be my scope, and that will complete all of part 1, and subsequently we'll do a part 2, okay, which might be a day or 2 later. Alright, so let's have a look at part 1. Okay, so what exactly do you understand by process costing? Okay, I'm not going to read out the textbook to you. I mean, that's not the point about you watching my video, right? So the idea about process cost is because this is applicable to certain businesses, such as drug manufacturing, right? And it could be, for example, chemicals production, producing of your detergent, production of your whatever cleaning solution for household use. Now another case where this is also applicable would be say for instance maybe tire manufacturing. Okay, basically it could be about anything, and it applies specifically for businesses where you have identical products. That means each unit of output is exactly the same or nearly the same, right? Like for example, we talk about your drugs, especially your pills, headache pills, painkillers. So these are almost identical, right? The same for your chemical production, like detergent. Would detergent be the same in terms of the ingredients? Yeah, it would be more or less about the same. Even tire manufacturing, right? Because each unit is about the same, so this leads us to one thing. How do we, using this idea, how do we determine the cost per unit, right? And again, like I mentioned before to you, those who attended my class on management accounting, the reason why you need to know the cost is for the fact that with this you are able to add a component for profit, and that enables you to determine the price. If not, it also helps you to determine if it's viable or even feasible to actually proceed to produce whatever that you're looking at, and to be able to make a profit out of it, right? Which is why you're looking at this topic of process cost, and this applies specifically for this, correct? Of course, if you're talking about other things like, for example, renovation, where each units are different, then you can't use process cost. It will be another topic, right? If you're talking about something like the services of a doctor or a dentist, process cost will not apply, because process cost requirement is that you must have identical products. Each unit that comes out must be almost the same, if not exactly the same, right? So as promised to you, I'm not going to read out the textbook, okay? Then that defeats the idea about doing this. Okay, now let's go on to then how does this help us to determine the cost? Okay, a simple example. Take for instance, you knew that your direct material for the period or for the month would be, say for instance, $1,000, and you knew that your direct labor cost would be another 600, right? And you knew exactly that the units of output is 1,000, apologies, 1,000 units, right? Now assuming if there is no opening and closing work in progress, so in progress meaning to say partially completed goods, okay? Now in such a case, if I'm going to give you this few pieces of information, this should immediately imply to you what is the cost per unit of output. Okay, this unit of output could be like pills or detergent or whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. So given this, you're able to determine the cost, and it works out as simple as this. You take your costs, you add them together and divide it by the total units of output. That gives you $1.60, which is what process costing is about. Very simple. But of course that's assuming if there is no opening work in progress, right? And that makes it quite simple. Okay, so now the next thing is to go through the concept of equivalent units. Okay, so I hope that this is clear to you. Now when we talk about the concept of equivalent units, what do we mean? The concept of equivalent units, what do we actually mean by this? Okay, to use an example that they have quoted in the lecture notes, and I think that's quite appropriate. That's example, if you have 4 cups, okay, 4 cups that is half filled. Now can we say that it is also the same as equal to 2 full cups? Right, so that is the idea of equivalent units. Basically equivalent units is to convert partially so-called completed units into whole units, right? Okay, now what happens if I relate you back to the example that I was talking about just now? And the example I given you just now was that in my production process factory, I went on to produce 1,000 units, and my output was also 1,000 units. Doesn't matter whether they are sold, but I had 1,000 completed units. Right. In this case, I say that I have 1,000 equivalent units, and all these units are so-called fully complete. But they are fully complete because, as the term implies, it's completed. Right. Okay, now to make things slightly more complicated, okay, watch very carefully now. So I've laid the foundation on equivalent units, and I'm going to put something a bit more complicated here. Let's say now, okay, my first example on this. Okay, so now let's say we have a slightly more interesting case. Okay, this case is that still I'm not going to have any opening and closing stocks, none at all, and I'm talking about work in progress stocks, not completed ones. I'm referring to work in progress stocks. So for instance, if I have initially put in some raw materials, let's say this production process only requires raw material, no labor needed, no overheads, it's pure raw materials. And that this raw material that we input is for making 100,000 units of whatever goods. Okay, so all these raw materials went right into my factory, like that. Okay, went right into the factory. So we found that, okay, fine. And the next part of the story is that 100,000 units were completed by the end of the period. 100,000. Okay? And note, I'm saying still that the assumption is there are no opening and closing stocks. Okay, further, the next thing is you are told that the raw material cost for the period was $200,000. Okay, fine. Therefore, this leads me to one thing, no. Okay, I put in 100,000 units and I completed 100,000 units. So the per unit, okay, can I say so? The per unit raw material cost should be, okay, it's very simple. Total raw material cost of 200,000 divided by 100,000 of completed units. I think you can guess what's the answer, and the answer is $2 per unit. Alright, agree? Alright, that's again similar to my earlier example, assuming no opening, no closing stocks, and further that what I made, all of them were completed. Okay, fine. Sorry, there's no dollar sign here. Okay, agreed now? Okay, so this is the next example I'm coming to. Now this next example isn't exactly very straightforward. Okay, I'm going to put this over. Let's say now we have a slightly different story, and now the story is that yeah, we have went on to make 100,000. Now our situation now is that out of this 100,000, 80,000 were complete, while the remaining 20,000 here remain incomplete. Okay, incomplete could be that, you know, they work halfway and then the goods are not ready to be taken out and sold. Okay, and what percentage of this is complete? Okay, this is only 60% complete. Okay, note 60% complete. This example is different because now I'm telling you that there is closing stocks. What stock am I talking about? Work in progress stock, but there is still no opening work in progress stock. So basically what I did was that I added one more item into the example, that is the closing work in progress. Okay, everything remained the same as you can see here. Fine. Now, question. In terms of equivalent units, how many are there? Okay, how many did you finish making? 80,000. But this 20,000 here is incomplete. How many or what percentage is it complete? 60%. So what we do to account for this is that we will simply just take 20,000 times 60%. And the reason for this is because this is the percentage that is done, and which means that the remaining 40% will be done maybe the next month or so. Okay, and this task leads us to 92,000 of equivalent units. Okay, quite simple. And then my next question is, therefore, how much is my per unit raw material cost? Would you know? My per unit raw material cost would be, okay, what you do is that following the same example with the same numbers, what was the raw material cost just now I quoted here? It was supposed to be $200,000. Right, that was the number I quoted you just now. So let me put here $200,000 divided by equivalent units, 92,000. That is your per unit raw material cost, right? Which is, as you can see here, is quite a contrast. my earlier example was that if there is no opening or closing work in progress, it's quite straightforward, right? You know that the equivalent units is just 100,000 because that's the quantity that you started making and you actually completed. But when you started to look at this example, there is quite a bit of difference. The difference is that the amount that is not complete, you actually have a percentage that was so-called done. So that allows you to work a bit further to find out what is the new equivalent units, right? Okay, so that does it, right? Very simple example. I'm going to show you one more example, right? So that confirms that you are able to understand how to apply this in a slightly different case. Okay? Let me bring this away. Now, I'm going to have my next example. My next example here would be the case of, okay, a factory here. Now this factory is quite simple. What happens to it is that they have no opening work in progress. Okay, that's the first thing, bear that in mind. And that we say is for the month of January. Okay, so in January what they did was that they started to make 2,000 units. Okay, 2,000 units of what is that? Say maybe component X. Okay. Now this component required only raw materials and probably some labor, right? But in my example, okay, and only required raw materials just for discussion's sake. Okay, later then we put in the labor part. Okay, so now this component X is very simple. It only required raw material, no labor input needed. So according to my example, the total raw material used was 8,000 for the month. Okay, at the end of the month there was some 600 units, and these were still incomplete. Now we say that there is one more thing that we know, that is they are only 20%. What is that? Complete. Okay, point one is, can you help me to calculate what is the equivalent unit, and two, the raw material cost per equivalent unit. Now this example looks very much like the earlier one that I've shown you. Basically this is to re-emphasize to you like how exactly I did it just now. Okay, so same process. How do you find the equivalent unit? Now to determine the equivalent unit, okay, first thing is that you have to ask yourself, first point, what do you need to find out? You need to find out what was the quantity that was fully complete. Okay, that's quite easy to find out. If they started to make 2,000 in a month and 600 is still incomplete, how many did they fully complete? So the answer is 2,000 minus 600. I emphasize here that I'm working with units without the dollars yet. Okay, units. Okay, next question. Then what about those that are incomplete? There is exactly 600 of them that were still incomplete. Total 2,000 in a month. Agree? Now let's go on to the equivalent units. Now this one, what this units about? This is referring to physical units. Okay, the actual number that you started making, right? Out of which 1,004 complete, 600 not complete. Okay, equivalent unit, quite simple. If it's fully complete, that means in terms of raw material, do you need to put in more raw material to finish? No, it's fully done, 100% complete. But those that are still incomplete, which is actually what I call the closing work in progress, stock at month end, there are 600 of them, and they are only 20% complete. So what you do is that take 600 times 20%, that gets you 120, which means that total equivalent unit is 1520. Correct? That's how it's worked out. Okay, and I have answered for you the first one, which is equivalent units. Can you see that? Right, 1520. Okay, next question. What do I mean by raw material cost per unit? And I'm not just talking about per unit, I'm referring to equivalent unit, which is about the same as my earlier example. Okay, referring to my example here, total material cost is 8,000, and now I'm looking for per unit equivalent unit, or per unit raw material cost. What I'll do is that I take 8,000 divided by equivalent unit of 1520, and that gets me the amount, which is the raw material cost per what unit? Equivalent unit. Now I have mentioned this equivalent unit quite a few times together with the cost per equivalent unit. Now why is this number so important? Now this number is important because it enables you to determine your cost per unit, correct, which I mentioned to you just now. And with the cost per unit, obviously it allows you to add whatever profit that you want, and that enables you to determine the final selling price, which is why you have to be able to determine what is the cost per equivalent unit. Then that helps you to determine eventually the price, okay, or to make decisions like whether it's worthwhile to go ahead and produce this whatever component. Right? Fine. Okay, so far this example is quite simple, and we are going to come to something a bit not so straightforward. Okay, this would be a lot more interesting. Okay, and this is my second example, which I would like to go through with you. Example 1. Now this example would be without opening, and there is no closing stocks. What stocks am I referring to? Work in progress stocks, not the finished ones. Okay, no finished goods. Okay, fine. Let me lay out the given information. Part 1. There are some materials available. We found that we had spent 100,000 of raw materials, and there are certain conversion costs, and these conversion costs amounted to $200,000. Now, for your information, if you have not done your reading, conversion cost refers to, okay, possibly any direct labor plus any overhead. It could be production overhead. Right. So the two of them would form what you call conversion cost. Okay, it's not a new concept. Basically, it's just the sum of two figures that you already have came across before. Okay. Sum of the two gets you $300,000. Got it? Okay, let's go on to the second set of information. Now we understand that the business had started to make 100,000 units, and we understand also that there are no opening and closing work in progress. Okay, as mentioned to you before earlier. Okay, your task: calculate the two things. What are they? 1. Equivalent units for raw material, equivalent units for labor, and finally the last part is to calculate the raw material cost per equivalent unit, and also to calculate the conversion cost per equivalent unit. Okay, so that's quite a number of items that you have to do, right? Okay, so let's go on to how we go about doing this. Now obviously now you have two sets of items that you need to work on, labor and material. You could work using the table given in the lecture notes, the table format. Okay, if not, you could work in other formats that is also, what do you call that, which is also not too messy. Okay, the most important thing is that clarity. Make sure that whichever way you present your answers, it has to be clear. Understand? Okay, so let's proceed to do firstly equivalent units, raw material. Now my habit is that I like to do it systematically. Okay, I like it to be clear. So how to get it clear? Now one possibility is that you can do it the lecture note style, which I quite prefer. Okay, let's proceed with that. Okay, so I have a column for physical units, and I'm going to have another column for equivalent units. Now don't worry about this column yet. Okay, we'll come to that later on, but physical units. Okay. Now, so what we understand is that there are no opening work in progress stocks. There is none. Now, do we have any units that we started making? Yep, we did. Actually, we started to make 100,000. Right? We started to make. Okay, and it was 100,000. Total 100,000. Right, easier. Right, it's simple because there is no opening and closing stocks. So that's why it's very simple. Okay, next thing. Equivalent unit in terms of raw material and labor. Right, because all 100,000 that started to make, all 100,000 was also completed in the same period. So therefore, equivalent units is still 100,000 for raw material, is still 100,000 for labor. Right. Now, am I able to find out then what is the cost per unit? Right. And I would like to find out in terms of equivalent unit. So for, in this case, the raw material or the direct material, and also the conversion cost. I would like to find out about those two. Okay, so how much is my material cost per equivalent unit? Okay, let's go on to this. Total material cost is 100,000. Equivalent unit for raw material is 100,000. So simple, $100,000 divided by 100,000 equivalent unit. So therefore, it works out to be $1 per equivalent unit. And let's go on to the next one, conversion cost. Conversion cost, okay, also known as labor and overheads. Right. So how do we find that? How do we find the conversion cost per unit? Okay, simple. Conversion cost total is 200,000. Divide that by number of equivalent units, and that gives you $2 per equivalent unit, and which tells us that to produce each unit, it will cost you $3. Right. Now this information is useful because then it enables you to determine your price. It also enables you to determine one more thing, which is the cost of your closing work in progress. So that's why this number is useful. It gives you a very good idea about these two, right? The first thing is the price, then of course second thing is the cost of your closing work in progress. Okay, fine. Now this is the example 1. Okay, not the end. Now I'm going to touch on example 2. Example 2, which is going to get a bit messier. It's not more difficult, just a bit messier. Right. Okay, so let's go on to example 2. Our final example before we conclude for this video. Right. So let's very quickly proceed to talk about example 2. I'm going to use similar numbers to example 1 so that you have something to compare against. Direct material cost would be 100,000. Same for the conversion cost, which is 200,000. And that gives us a total of 300,000. And then we also understand that the factory started to make 100,000 units. Right. So as with the earlier example, we are not going to have any opening stock of work in progress at the beginning of the period. So note that at the beginning of period there are no work in progress stocks. Okay, work in progress being partially complete goods. Okay. And next, at the end of the period, however, there was some work in progress because there was 20,000 units left incomplete. Now this is going to make your question a bit more interesting now, right? Interesting in the sense that it is not so straightforward like just now where you have no opening, no closing work in progress. Now you have some closing work in progress. Okay, now for the complication. These units were 20% complete in terms of raw material and 40% complete in terms of labor, or maybe to be more exact, conversion cost. Conversion cost including labor and your production overheads. Okay, so these are the given information, and like the earlier example, we are going to try to calculate equivalent units for raw material, and next we're going to try to calculate equivalent unit for conversion cost. Okay, so let's give it a try. Then of course once we are done, what we'll do is that we're going to find out the raw material cost per equivalent unit, and to finally finish with conversion cost per equivalent unit. Okay, so let's very quickly move to that. Okay, so the first task that you should do is that we're going to try to find out what is the equivalent unit for material. Okay, the format that you could use, okay, there is no fixed format. You could follow that example I use, or you can follow your lecture notes. Both are fine, really. Right? Most important thing is clarity, right? Okay, so how do we go about it? The first step that you should do is that you should determine what is the physical units. Okay? Physical units. So start by determining whether there is any work in progress. Now, of course, this opening work in progress will be covered in part 2. So meantime, since I have not covered it and it's not in the example, it's 0, right? Unit started. How many did you start to make in this period? You started to make in this period 100,000 units. Right. Now the breakdown of this is that some are done, some are incomplete. Okay, remember this is different from my example 1 because example 1 was all completed. But this is all started but some of them still incomplete. So there is a breakdown. Let's have a look at the breakdown. So my breakdown tells me that there are those that are fully complete and those that are not complete. So we have and they become our ending work in progress or closing work in progress. Okay. Question: if you have 20,000 not complete, you try to make 100,000, so then this implies that you have completed 80,000, but 20,000 still incomplete, and we call that work in progress. So total there were 100,000 units. Fine. Okay, step 2 is now we have to find the equivalent unit for the material and the equivalent unit for the conversion cost. Let's start with the material, the easier one. Actually, both are about the same. Okay, question. If let's say the material, or if let's say the 80,000 is fully complete, do you need to add additional materials to complete the this 80,000? No, there isn't any you need to add. If it's fully complete, it's 100% complete. 80,000 times 100% gets you 80,000 still. But the fact was that 20% complete with regards to the closing work in progress. So this 20,000 is not fully complete. You have to add some more materials to complete that. Okay? But meantime, we understand that they only completed 20% of it. Take that 20,000 times 20%, and that gets you 4,000. Your equivalent units, or to be complete, this total equivalent units would be 84,000. Now this is only the equivalent units for direct materials, right? Fine. Okay, next thing. So if you understand this, then conversion cost will be quite similar. Okay, let's understand conversion cost. Okay, you have made 80,000, alright, and these are fully complete. So since they are fully complete, do you need to put any more man hours to complete? No, you wouldn't need to, because it's 100% complete. So 80,000 times 100% will get you 80,000 still. Now the thing that will be different is the closing work in progress or ending work in progress. According to the example, it says there that the closing work in progress is 40% complete in terms of conversion cost. 40% complete in terms of conversion cost. What you do is that you take that 20,000 times 40%. That gets you 8,000. Right, that gets you 8,000. And which means that the equivalent unit for conversion cost is 88,000. Right. And a bit different from direct materials. Right. So there you have it. Okay. So my next question is, okay, that's not the end. Now we are going to find out what is the one thing is the raw material cost per equivalent unit. So this is what we're going to find out next. Now what is the total material cost? 100,000. What is the equivalent unit that you have for material? 84,000. 100,000 divided by 84,000, that gets you the material cost per equivalent unit. Do the same for conversion cost. You need to find conversion cost per equivalent unit. How do you find that? Total conversion cost is 200,000. Equivalent unit for conversion cost is 88,000. Divide, and that gets you the conversion cost per equivalent unit. And with this, you are able to determine cost per unit. And once you're able to determine cost per unit, you can determine the price. Then you can make a decisions about whether to proceed to produce the goods or not. Right? So I have explained to you two very important things: conversion cost, and following that, not forgetting the equivalent unit, which is the most important concept of all. Right? So the format that you're looking at is actually from the lecture notes. It's not a newly created format. Okay, so with this, I hope that you can refer to the notes, and when you read out the notes, it makes more sense to you. Alright, so I covered for you, again, just to explain to you, I covered for you why we do process costing, and then the very important thing is how we determine equivalent units. But so far what I've done for you is that I only touched until the how you handle ending work in progress. Whereas for opening work in progress, that will be in my following part 2, right? Because opening work in progress, the way it is handled, there are at least 2 approaches. Either it's weighted average or it's first in first out, which we'll be talking about it soon. Alright, so I hope that this gives you a lot more insight on how this is done. Right, give me about another half day or so, I'll come up with a part 2 to explain to you the process costing, covering opening work in progress, how you handle it, how you treat this using the weighted average method and the first in first out method. Okay, so and meantime, have a good weekend, and I'll see you soon in my part 2 video. If not, I'll see you in class. Have a good day.